never done this before, so we're going to explore this with everyone else as well. And today I'm online with Haseeb. Haseeb and I have been friends for a while now, probably a couple of years, and so we go way back.
Yeah.
And we were just chatting this weekend, and we were chatting about Bitcoin. And one of the things he said was that he doesn't believe Bitcoin will be more than a store of value. And I read that, and I was like, okay, I kind of disagree with that claim. And I want to have a fun debate with him about it. And that's kind of what we're building at True Story. We're building a platform where people can have civilized debates and figure out the truth by having these debates. And so I figured, since we're not launched yet, why not just give the world a flavor of what we're doing in the app over Twitter? And so here we are. And me and him didn't talk before this at all. We just kind of decided that we're going to debate about this live. And so this is all impromptu. We'll just see how it goes.
So be gentle is what she's saying.
Yeah, be gentle. And the point of this is not to really say that I'm right or he's right. It's really just to explore our sides and really figure out how we can learn from each other and see whether one side has more merit to the other or they're both equally valid points. And so, again, the claim is Bitcoin going to be more than a store of value? And before I jump into that, I do want to give a quick introduction for anyone who doesn't know Haseeb. Haseeb, he has an interesting background. He used to be a professional poker player when he was younger, and then he taught himself how to code. Around the same time, I taught myself how to code, so we kind of have that shared history. And then he went on to join Airbnb as an engineer. I went on to join Coinbase as an engineer. And then he, after Airbnb, went to work with Balaji at Earn.com. And then after that, he worked with Naval at Metastable. And now he's on to bigger and better things, which none of us know yet, but we'll know, I guess, soon.
That's right.
And so that's kind of the context. And we've both been in the crypto space for a few years now. And so we kind of have different, we agree on a lot, but we disagree on a lot. So I'm excited for this debate. And again, the topic is Bitcoin going to be more than a store of value? And before we jump in, I think there's a few things that we have to agree on for us to even have this conversation. One is, what is a store of value? And I'm going to quickly share my screen because I think it's important to agree on this. 1 sec. Okay. So a store of value, I pulled up the Wikipedia definition. A store of value is the function of an asset that can be saved, retrieved, and exchanged at a later time, and predictably useful when retrieved. More generally, a store of value is anything that retains purchasing power into the future. Okay? The most common stores of value in modern time has been money, currency, or a commodity like a precious metal or financial capital. And the point of any store of value is risk management due to a stable demand for the underlying asset. And money is one of the best stores of value because of its liquidity. That is, it can be easily exchanged for other goods and services. So essentially, a store of value is any asset that can store value and can be saved, retrieved, and exchanged at a later time. And then the important thing to note here is that it can be predictably useful when retrieved, meaning like it can retain its purchasing power into the future. So if I own a USD now, I know that in 2 years from now, that USD will also purchase me some stuff in the future. And then the other point that they make here is interesting is that a store of value the point of a store of value is risk management, meaning like you believe that this is a good place to store your value because it's low risk and it's going to be likely valuable in the future. So there's a stable demand for the underlying asset. So that's kind of the fundamental definition of a store of value. And I think to even get into this debate, we have to agree that Bitcoin has the potential to be a store of value, right? And I'm going to argue that, yes, Bitcoin does have the potential to be a store of value because any asset can be a store of value. But I'm going to argue that Bitcoin today is not a store of value. And I pulled up this chart here, and this is an all-time chart of Bitcoin's price. And you can see that within the time span of 2 years, Bitcoin went from like 1K to basically 19K to like back to 3.9K. So it's kind of fluctuated pretty wildly. And I'd argue that I'm confident enough to say Bitcoin is a store of value yet, because I'm not going to, it's still high risk. I'm not going to put my money in here and assume that it's going to be a low risk investment for me. At least not most people, because I would rather put my money in USD because it's not as volatile right now, at least. And so I think Bitcoin has the potential to be a store of value, but it's not a store of value yet. So with that, I think now the question is, the question that we're really trying to get to is, can it be more than a store of value? And if we're going to talk about that, I think, let me stop sharing my screen.
Oh, shit.
Yeah.
Oh, my God.
Okay, so now the question is, can it be more than a store of value? So what more can Bitcoin be? Can it be a medium of exchange, or can it be a unit of account? Is something along the lines of what we're trying to agree or disagree on.
Mm-hmm.
And fundamentally what I'm saying is, yes, I believe that it can still be more than just a store of value. And I think it has all the properties necessary to become a store of value. It's digital, it can't be counterfeited, it allows for micropayments, which is just not possible with cash. There's a whole set of properties that I think we can generally agree on that make Bitcoin still potentially more than just a store of value. And I'm going to go back to something that I remember Marc Andreessen said in 2014 in, I think, a New York Post article, where he kind of talked about the potential of Bitcoin. And he was like, it can be used for digital stocks, it can be used for digital equities, digital fundraising, digital bonds, digital contracts, digital keys, titles. You get the point. I think it can be used for a lot. And I think it's too early to say, like, let's shelve that possibility and just assume that it's only going to be a store of value and it's not going to be all these other things, because we're only, 5 years. I think Marc Andreessen said this 5 years ago, and he ended that article by saying, 20 years from now, we'll look back at Bitcoin just like we look back on the internet today. And we're only 5 years into that 20-year journey. So I'd argue that it's a little bit too early to argue that Bitcoin can't be all these other things that we envision it could be. And so I just generally think that when you say Bitcoin can't be more than a store of value, you're overestimating what's possible in the short run and maybe underestimating what's possible in the long run. And that's normal because, like, we're humans and we want things to go fast. And the other thing I kind of want to point out is when Bitcoin first started, there was never this like narrative around it being a store of value. And that's kind of what I find even more a little bit confusing, because Bitcoin started as, even in the white paper, it says it's a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And that was kind of the whole thing when Bitcoin launched. It was like, oh, it's going to be this like internet money. It's going to be fast. It's going to be low fees. It's going to be borderless. And then we started to realize that actually the fees are really high. It's really slow. The network is congested. The UX is really terrible. And so the whole narrative around it being a payments rail shifted to now it being a store of value. And fundamentally, I think that's a weird way to think about it, because I'm going to argue that for something to be a store of value, it has to be something more than a store of value in the first place. I don't think we can flip the equation and say first it'll be a store of value and then it'll be other things. I think, like, for an asset to store value, it has to be like intrinsically valuable, meaning there has to be some desire for this, and that desire comes from some other utility for it. Otherwise, like, I don't think we can fundamentally value an asset purely on speculative demand for it forever. And so I think, like, where I fail to understand your claim, Haseeb, is that, like, I just don't understand how Bitcoin can even be a store of value if it's not something more in the first place. So I think fundamentally, I believe it'll either be nothing, meaning like it won't be a store of value, or anything more, or it'll be more. I don't think it can be just a store of value. I don't think you can separate utility and store of value. Like, it's either both or nothing. And so I'm going to kind of end there, and I want you to try to convince me where my thinking might be wrong, or where you come from your side of the argument.
Cool, awesome. Okay, so you laid out a lot of points. I'm going to try to address some of them how I can, but I also kind of want to start by laying out the foundation of my own argument. And before I get into this, I want to first caveat anything I say with, one, I'm not an economist. Two, I come from this with the humility of I don't know. And I think, right now we're all kind of in the phase of conjecturing about what's fundamentally a fairly new phenomenon in the world and in human history, which is the emergence of, non-sovereign digital currencies. Like, that's crazy. We're both trying to figure this out in real time. So it's pretty likely that I'll get something wrong. And if so, I hope that people will forgive me and decide for themselves what they think is true. So why do I think Bitcoin won't be more than a store of value? So there are a few reasons for this. The first fundamental reason why I think Bitcoin won't be more than a store of value is that I think the way that Bitcoin Core and basically the ethos of Bitcoin has kind of congealed around it primarily acting as a sort of digital gold, right? And there are a number of things built into the system that make it kind of behave that way. So one is the fact that it's deflationary. And it's sort of a well-known phenomenon in economics that deflationary assets do not tend to make good currencies. Okay, there are a few reasons for this. So one is that sort of people understand that in an economy where you have two things going on at the same time. So one, you have money, and the second thing you have are goods, and you have money essentially chasing goods. If you have a deflationary money, then what that means is that the supply of money is shrinking relative to the supply of goods. And so the prices of goods are going to get lower and lower and lower. And this triggers in economics what's known as a deflationary spiral. And basically it means that people want to hoard their assets because prices are going down. And if they wait longer, they'll be able to buy even more with the money that they already have. And that leads to this sort of, you can imagine how if nobody's willing to spend money because everybody thinks their money is going to be worth more and more in the future, this can lead to really bad things and basically a breakdown in the economy. And so generally speaking, it's understood that you want some degree of inflation in an economy, especially an economy that's growing, which is pretty much all economies in the world because economies are getting bigger and we're creating new technology. So the world is growing and it's going to continue to grow. And so every central bank in the world that is managing a currency has some kind of inflation that it tries to target, as well as trying to target maximizing employment, which maximizes productivity. So there's one aspect of Bitcoin, which is the fact that there's this 21 million supply, right? 21 million supply means that Bitcoin eventually, once it does enough halvings, will essentially have zero inflation. Okay, so that in and of itself is kind of bad, but actually it's not just zero inflation; it's actually deflationary because people lose Bitcoins, right? And so when you lose a Bitcoin or you lose an entire wallet full of them, then the supply of Bitcoin gets smaller, and essentially this becomes a deflationary currency, and the supply only gets smaller and smaller over time. So that's sort of in the limit, right? That's when Bitcoin sort of reaches its full potential and has full adoption, and we kind of have this relatively stable deflationary price impact on the value of Bitcoins. So that's one reason why I think Bitcoin is not well suited to be a store of more than a store of value. Now the second reason is actually let me rewind a little bit. There's also a notion in economics known as Gresham's law. And Gresham's law is this idea that good currency drives out bad currency. And let me explain very briefly what that means. Imagine that you have two kinds of money in your economy. Okay, one kind of money, let's say, is let's say it's perishable, right? Such as, for example, let's say that there are two kinds of money in the economy. One of them is, I don't know, cakes, and the other one is gold. Okay, so if you can spend money using cakes or gold, well, cakes go bad after a little while, right? So you'll really want to spend your cakes and keep your gold, right? It would be a bad idea to like spend your gold and keep your cakes because the cake is eventually going to go bad, right? And you can analogize going bad to basically being a more inflationary currency, right? Like the longer you keep the inflationary currency, the more it's going to spoil and the less value it's going to be in the future. So if you have a deflationary currency and then a non-deflationary currency, you'll want to spend the non-deflationary currency because you'll want to keep the stuff that's going to go up in value, right? And so what that means is that everything that circulates in the economy is unlikely to be the deflationary asset. It's likely to be the inflationary assets that people are willing to accept as mediums of exchange. So this is another reason why it's very unlikely that even in societies where people value gold very highly, like in India, for example, gold is very, very important to Indian culture as a store of value. But people don't transact with gold, right? They transact with rupees because rupees are inflationary. Rupees are much more volatile. And people sort of understand that, look, I want to hold on to my gold. And if I have some value that I want to let go of in the moment, I'm going to do it with rupees, not with the gold, right? I suspect this will be the exact same phenomenon you see with Bitcoin once Bitcoin reaches its full kind of steady state as being a deflationary currency. So the second reason why I think Bitcoin is not going to be more than a store of value is in that the way that Bitcoin has been engineered and the way that it's been changed over time. One, in that the block size hasn't dramatically increased in response to demand. It's very, very difficult for Bitcoin to scale on chain, and any reasonable projections that people can put together on, even let's imagine that you onboarded the whole world onto Lightning, which I think is fairly unlikely. Even in that case, like there's just no way that Bitcoin can support billions of people or hundreds of millions of people transacting on chain with only 7 transactions per second. Now, some people want to dispute that, and they come up with fairly obscure ways to like somehow jam bunches of people into Lightning channels. But the reality is, it's very unlikely that 7 transactions per second is the optimal number of transactions to be able to fit into a world scale currency, right? If you believe it's 7, why not 1? If you believe it's 1, if you believe it's 7, why not 14, right? Do you know that 7 is the right number? Well, the Bitcoin core people basically are ideologically committed to the stability of Bitcoin being just exactly the way that it is. And it turns out, I think this actually encourages in many ways for people to treat Bitcoin as a kind of digital gold, because of the fact that it's fairly hard to move. Not a lot of people can move it simultaneously. It has fairly limited functionality. All of the properties that are built into the Bitcoin system, and the fact that it's extremely immune to change, both on a technological and political level, mean that people are likely to treat it like a kind of gold, right? But for something like a payment system needs to do a whole lot more than just be able to move stuff around. So you mentioned, Marc Andreessen writing in 2014, basically believing that Bitcoin was going to be used for digital assets, stocks, bonds, all these sorts of things are going to be digitized and put on top of Bitcoin. And you also then claim that it's too early to write off these possibilities for Bitcoin because we've only seen it for 5 years. Well, to be fair, Marc Andreessen said that in 2014, and in 2014, I think a lot of people, a lot of technologists, really believed that Bitcoin was going to evolve. This is before Ethereum. This is before the explosion of really high value altcoins, and I think people didn't anticipate that Bitcoin wasn't going to incorporate all of the other research and ideas from other cryptocurrencies to try to basically become this, Swiss Army knife of all of the functionality that people wanted to see, that for which there was demonstrated demand in altcoins, right? Bitcoin's attitude was always at that time, look, the altcoins can kind of be these experimental grounds, and the good features we'll go ahead and incorporate into Bitcoin. And we basically saw almost nothing get incorporated into Bitcoin. And I think, Marc Andreessen was very much speaking from this time when people expected that to happen. And I think now, post-Ethereum, it's fairly clear that Bitcoin actually is totally opposed to any radical transformation of Bitcoin functionality. There's no way to do stocks and bonds and things like that on Bitcoin. It just doesn't have enough functionality to it. And that's what the Bitcoin core people want. They're okay with that. They don't want Bitcoin to be more than essentially what it is, which is a very stable system for transacting UTXOs of Bitcoin value. I get the feeling that I'm over time. So,
no, I do want to. You can have more time for sure, but I have a few questions about what you just said.
Yes.
So first, I think you said deflationary assets don't make good currencies. I generally think your argument there was pretty sound, and I would agree with that. The one thing I want to ask is, like, you mentioned how the 21 million limit of Bitcoin makes people want to hoard it and not want to spend it. And for me, I don't understand why that's a problem, given that Bitcoin is like basically infinitely divisible, or at least like until 18 decimal places. Like, it's not like we can't divide it and still have a decent currency, right? Totally. So like, why is that such a hard limit? Like,
so that's a great question. The question is ultimately like, why wouldn't prices, and why wouldn't everybody just like respond to the fact that Bitcoin is going up in price and then like just reprice everything? Right? Because it's okay, well, it's not infinitely divisible, right? There's also the dust problem, which is a big issue. Like, if Bitcoin becomes worth $20,000 per Bitcoin, then like, I think right now Bitcoin dust is in like, several cents. I don't know if people know what dust is. Dust is basically the size of a UTXO in Satoshis. Satoshis is like the smallest unit of Bitcoins. The dust limit is basically how few Satoshis can you have in a UTXO such that it costs more to send the UTXO over the Bitcoin network than the Satoshis actually are worth, right? So imagine you have like 1 Satoshi. I guarantee you that it costs more than 1 Satoshi to send 1 Satoshi over the Bitcoin network, because the Bitcoin network measures cost per byte, right? and the size of that UTXO and the signature and all that is just more than what it would cost to send it, meaning that that is now unspendable. It's sort of the money just sort of like turned into thin air, and you can't spend it anymore, right? That's known as the dust limit. And so exchanges and things like that, companies that have lots of tiny little UTXOs, they have to deal with this problem of trying to get around the fact that their UTXOs are disappearing on them as the dust limit. If Bitcoin increased like 20x and fee markets became much more competitive, then you would have like, I don't know, like 50 cents being too expensive to send. Now, if you go to the Lightning channel, you can avoid a lot of these problems. But on the base layer, like this is also another issue that would happen if Bitcoin actually became a world scale currency. But so let's rewind to the question you asked. The question you asked was, why won't people just reprice assets in real time and say, okay, instead of 5 Satoshis, now it's 4 Satoshis because Bitcoin is worth more, right? Yeah. And so the answer is that a very important property that economists have discovered, and one of the bases of macroeconomics, is what's called price stickiness or wage stickiness. And it's this idea that even when you get fluctuations in the purchasing power of money, wages, even though a lot of things people are fairly willing to reprice quickly, like obviously just by natures of markets, prices move up and down, but wages do not tend to move up and down. And there's a notion of what's called menu cost, and menu cost is basically, imagine you have a menu and you're pricing, your food. Now your suppliers are going to keep changing their prices on you because that's a marketplace, right? And in the market, prices move. But it costs you money to like keep repricing your menu and keep grabbing new printing runs of all the prices on your menu to make sure that you can still get the right markup and you're not selling your food at a loss, right? That's called the menu cost. So that makes it somewhat sticky, the prices that you have for your goods that you're selling to consumers. Now in a digital age, maybe that's a lot easier, but this is sort of known that like prices don't update in real time, but wages update even slower. Okay, so wages are the stickiest of all. And the idea here is fairly straightforward, right? Like if prices are moving around all the time, then you'll have to tell your workers, like, you're running a business, you would understand what this is like. What if you have to go tell your lead engineer, hey, we're cutting your wage in Bitcoins? And he's like, wait, what the hell? I've been doing great work. Like I've been awesome. And he's like, yeah, no, you're awesome. It's just like Bitcoin is going up and like it's kind of hard to explain. Like they're just not going to feel happy about it, right? They're going to get pissed off. And so it turns out that the real economy is made up of individuals and relationships and cognitive biases and all this sort of stuff. And people don't incorporate price information in real time, especially when it comes to wages. So if wages are sticky, then that means that it's going to be very hard for you to modulate your wages for the people you're currently paying. And that means that some people are going to have to you're going to have to fire some people because you're now overpaying all your workers. And that leads to unemployment. And that is what triggers a lot of these deflationary spirals, is the fact that prices don't always update in real time, especially when it comes to employment.
So your argument is, even though it's divisible and prices can theoretically update, because of the nature of how life works, it just won't update in real time.
Exactly.
Are there any examples that we can look to in history of this being the case, where prices just didn't update in real time, despite being divisible? I guess
that's a good question. I should have a good answer for that. I'm not being an economic historian. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I think for any deflationary spiral, like this is one of the most common things that you're going to see. Yeah.
So then the second question I have is, you mentioned how right now the Bitcoin throughput is like 7 transactions per second or something.
Yeah.
And that was kind of your argument for why it's just like it's not really a good payment rail.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if you remember, in the early days of the internet, we didn't think sending a picture across the wire was possible. Mm-hmm. So I think I don't know. I know that's a very easy analogy to make, but
yeah.
Don't you think it's too early to say, oh, it's only 7 transactions per second now, that will never change into the future? I think we didn't think that was possible with the internet, and now we're basically having a video chat and then broadcasting it to Twitter. Who would have thought that was possible, right?
Well, I mean, to be clear, we know that Bitcoin can do more. I mean, look at Bitcoin SV that wants to have 1 gigabyte blocks or whatever. They're going to have some insane multiple of 7 transactions. They're going to have hundreds of transactions per second possible using their. I mean, I think it's absolutely stupid what they're doing, but that would make Bitcoin much more scalable as a payments layer. It's very clear that Bitcoin Core is totally opposed to that. And I think for
Oh,
good reason.
okay. So your argument is it's possible, but you're saying philosophically the people want it to be just a store of value, stable, deflationary, like gold, but they don't want it to be a payment system.
Right. I'm not talking about cryptocurrencies generally. To be
Yeah.
clear, I'm not saying that all cryptocurrencies have this property. I'm
Yeah.
talking specifically about Bitcoin. And of course, when I say Bitcoin, I mean Bitcoin Core.
Okay. And do you agree with me that that might be a change in narrative compared to what it was in the early days?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, to be clear, I think in the early days there was not a whole lot of coherent narrative around what Bitcoin was going to be because it was an experiment. It was just like this crazy idea that people put together and got excited about. And it's very clear if you talk to the early proponents, nobody expected it to be nearly as successful or as big as it was. And Bitcoin has evolved by virtue of just being on this world scale or on this world stage that it's never been on before, and it's been forced to generate a new identity for itself. And that's kind of what's happened. I mean, it's what happened to all these cryptocurrencies, right?
That's fascinating. And like the big question I have for you then is, okay, so these core developers, they philosophically believe this should be digital gold, so it should store value. Currently, how the Bitcoin blockchain works is there's a bunch of miners who are securing the network, and the reason they secure the network is because they're incentivized by block rewards. So every time you mine a new block, you get rewarded in Bitcoin, and the Bitcoin has value, so you're earning money by mining. But at some point, once the 21 million Bitcoin have been mined, we're going to only move. The only way that miners are going to be incentivized is by fees, right? Transaction fees.
Yes.
And so if Bitcoin is a store of value, and no one, like, usually stores of value, people are not really transacting with it, at least not the definition that you're telling me what store of value is. Store of value, you're saying that people are going to hoard this thing, right. In which case there's not going to be transactions. So how does the network get secured? And then doesn't that mean that there's no value in the network itself, because like no one wants to secure the network without any transactions?
Yeah, so that's also a fantastic question.
Okay.
So I'd say there are two answers to this, or several answers to this, really. So one is that it's not that there will be no transactions, right? So even something like gold, that in India, gold is a store of value, but it's not that there's no market for gold, right? There is a market for gold, because sometimes you have your store of value and you need to sell some of it to go get some currency that you can go spend on buying some food, right? So it's very clear that even with a store of value, there is some market for it, but it's nowhere near as liquid as the market for money.
Okay.
So there is going to be some underlying demand for transacting on the Bitcoin blockchain. However, that demand is not necessarily proportional to the amount of value that is held on the Bitcoin chain. Okay. So what I mean by that is that let's say that there is some demand. Let's say we're now in a post block reward world. The year is 2140. Block reward is now 0, and so it's all transaction fees, right? So a lot of people are well aware that Bitcoin has a lot of problems in a world where there's 0 block reward, in large part because of the volatility of fees per block. And there are ways to get around this, but you would require hard forks to do it. So the principal problem is that the security of Bitcoin, right now it's kind of secured by the amount of value in each block, which is the incentive for miners to keep the Bitcoin network secure through their mining power. Now, there's no reason in principle why because ultimately, putting transactions into blocks is a supply-demand problem, right? People are going to be willing to pay as much as how much demand there is to get into blocks. So if there is very little demand to get into blocks, then people aren't going to be willing to pay very much, and therefore, miners will just, marginal cost will equal marginal revenue or whatever, and basically there won't be a lot of value going through Bitcoin blocks, and therefore not a lot of people will be mining. Therefore, the security of the network will be low. Now, that's kind of crappy. That's not great. But it basically means that, like, one, you're not going to be incentivized to move value in and out of Bitcoin very frequently. It doesn't mean that Bitcoin won't be valuable. It just means that the amount of money that's safe to move through blocks will be much lower, right? So Bitcoin can have $1 trillion of value in it, but even if the security of each block is quite low, it just means that the value that it's safe to move through that block is low, even if the value of all the Bitcoin in existence is $1 trillion. Okay, why? Because remember, what does proof of work secure you against? It secures you against 51% attacks. It secures you against double spends, right? So great. I want to make sure that I don't get double spent on, but I can't get double spent of all the money that I have sitting around in my UTXO set, right? The only money that I can get double spent is the money that I send in a block,
Okay.
So the money that gets sent in a block is constrained by the security of the Bitcoin network.
So you're saying basically that even in the scenario that where the transaction throughput might be lower because it's a store of value and people are not using it for anything else, um, that doesn't imply that the price of Bitcoin necessarily has to go down. Like the price can still stay up there, and then the transaction fees would be high enough to incentivize miners to still mine.
Yes, I mean they'll always be incentivized to mine. Just it might not be very much, and it might not be a whole lot of security, right? There might be very few miners who are still mining on Bitcoin.
In which case, doesn't that mean the network is that very, very insecure if there's only a few
correct.
miners? Yeah.
Okay. Totally. Which just means that like the money that can be flowing through Bitcoin has to be relatively small at any given time, right? In order to match that security level, or you just have to very much trust whoever you're sending your money to. So which is a fairly likely way to solve that problem.
So that argument I don't get, because for something to be a good store of value, I'd want it to be more secure.
I agree.
If it's less secure, then it's no longer a good store of value.
Totally agreed. So I think it's quite likely that if Bitcoin ever gets to that place and realizes that, oh shit, this is not a really good status quo for this thing retaining its value as a store of value, I think it's fairly plausible that there might be a hard fork to put back in some very low rate of inflation. So Monero, for example, has this tail emission that even when sort of has this Bitcoin-like emissions curve, but it never goes to zero. It goes to 0.6%, right? Which is very low. It's like much lower than any natural resource in the world. But it's enough that there's always a block reward, and that block reward is relatively stable. So I think it's fairly plausible that Bitcoin might move to that model to try to retain some economic security, even when the block reward is been mostly minimized.
Exactly. Like to me, I think like if I'm going to store my wealth in Bitcoin for it to be a good store of value, I want to argue that I want it to be a secure network. I want it to be as decentralized as possible and as censorship resistant as possible. But if people are not using Bitcoin for anything and not transacting it with it for anything, and so the number of miners goes down because they don't have the incentive to mine anymore, then it no longer is secure, and so it creates this like loop of like almost this downward spiral where it just becomes less and less of a good store of value. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, where I'm saying like to even ever be a store of value, I think it has to be something more.
I think that's potentially true. However, I can also imagine a lot of scenarios where that doesn't happen, right? And this is it's sort of far-fetched because obviously this is very, very kind of abstracting into the future. But imagine that the world sort of accepts Bitcoin as a new digital gold, and everybody sort of converges on like, yes, Bitcoin is digital gold. We get it. We all believe it, right? Eventually, the security of the network goes down. But people are already kind of bought into this idea that like Bitcoin is gold and everybody has Bitcoin and everybody uses Bitcoin, and like it's sort of everybody's transacting on layer 2, or they're transacting through institutions that they trust that are sort of intermediaries, right? So like I don't know, Coinbase or BitGo or something. Sort of most people have BitGo wallets or Coinbase wallets, but at bottom it's Bitcoin, but like you're not actually holding it yourself, or your bank is custodying your Bitcoin for you, and your bank your credit card is connected to your Bitcoin or whatever, right? One can imagine a world where something like this happens. Now, in that world, it's kind of just a sort of detail of how Bitcoin actually settles on the underlying network, right? Because you're not touching the underlying network. It's very unlikely that in the future, we're all going to be settling our transactions on Bitcoin. In fact, this is what the Bitcoin core guys say definitely won't happen because of the fact that Bitcoin only has 7 transactions per second, and you got to scale a layer up.
But like right? you're fundamentally making a huge leap here, where we're all of a sudden everyone in the world is going to assume that Bitcoin is digital gold.
For the sake of argument, right? Grant me this for the sake of argument.
So if that becomes the case, of course, then it becomes a store of value, because then in that case, you can make the analogy to go directly to gold, because gold realistically today, I mean, it has industrial use cases, but really why it has value and why I'm willing to store my value in it is because I know that it's been valuable to humans for centuries. And the likelihood of that changing overnight is impossible. I don't think we can say that with Bitcoin today. Like Bitcoin's been around for 10 years, and so maybe in 200 years we can say, yes, it becomes digital gold, but we're nowhere close to that yet.
I agree. Although it's also worth recognizing that like even for something like fiat currencies, right? Like they're not that old. Fiat currencies are,
fiat currencies are backed by a government, right? They're backed by an army.
That's true. But like pure fiat non-gold backed governments, like Bretton Woods was only broken in like 1974, right? Also not that long ago. This was about 50 years. So I think the reality is like a lot of how our financial system works, especially in like a digital first age, is really a lot of sort of relatively untested assumptions for abstracting them out 200 years in the future. And I think Bitcoin is no different. But like before I worry about that in 200 years, I worry about whether public key cryptography still works in 200 years. But the argument that I want to make is that imagine if fundamentally people believe in Bitcoin and they roughly all agree Bitcoin is valuable, right? Like what you described as a store of value was simply the idea that a value or an asset stores value and can predictably retrieve it later in the future, right? That is not a property of an asset so much as it's a property of a market, right? An asset retaining its purchasing power is a property of how people will value it in the future. And if people will value it in the future because everybody's just fucking bought in and we all have the infrastructure and everybody just kind of agrees sort of by social agreement that yes, Bitcoin is valuable, then we all sort of agree that, hey, that's how we're going to denote and store our wealth. Now, in that world, let's say that the base layer, the base chain, sort of becomes just wildly insecure. Is there a way around it? And I think the answer is probably yes, right? If you imagine that, like, let's just say like every bank in the world owns a bunch of Bitcoin and most people have their Bitcoin intermediated through banks, well, banks just don't settle with each other very frequently. And when they do, they just do it in very small increments. And everybody else just has their Bitcoin through banks. Or if it's, Lightning, then like channels settle very, very infrequently and they only settle in small amounts in order to make sure that the block isn't oversaturated given the level of security. But like you just basically never close a Lightning channel because if so, like you'll just get fucked on fees trying to get it through the very, very insecure base layer. Or for example, imagine like something like Cosmos comes around, tokenizes all the Bitcoin in existence, and then all the Bitcoin in the world trades on Ethereum or on some other network. But Bitcoin itself still has value because we all agree it does. Like it didn't really matter that there was a chain and that there was a hash rate and there was a this and a that. Like the real important thing is that we all just kind of agree that hey, Bitcoin is a valuable thing and we're agreed to denote our wealth that way, right? Okay. And that social agreement is the hard part, not the hash rate, not the particulars of how proof of work operates. I can see that being possible once Bitcoin solves the much harder problem of getting people to agree that this is now the way that we denote our wealth.
Yeah, this is the biggest. I think I would agree. Okay, so what you're arguing is like we haven't made that leap yet. We haven't made the leap that Bitcoin is going to be the store of value, but you're saying like it is totally possible because that's the narrative that's being pushed today. And that's the narrative that they're going to push. But you don't believe that because of the natures of what Bitcoin is, it's deflationary, people are just going to naturally hoard it. You don't believe it can be used for, you don't think people will use it for commerce. They're just going to want to hoard it.
Correct.
Okay. And it's interesting. Like, I think we'll have to see how it plays out. For me, I fundamentally, I'm going to still stick to my stance. And I'm going to say, I think, for me to want to store my value in Bitcoin, I don't think I'm going to just go off of people's social belief in it. I'm going to go off of like, okay, this thing is going to be valuable 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. And the only way I'll know that is if people are actually, it provides some utility to people besides just for the sake of hoarding it for the sake of hoarding it.
Right.
And so that's kind of where I come from. I'm saying like either it becomes nothing, like meaning it's not a store of value or a utility token, or it becomes both. And I think the only way to know this is to really just move, I guess, like go into the future or something. But
totally. I mean, look, the most likely outcome is that like all this stuff fails, right? Because like most things fail, and this is like a crazy experiment, and I'd love to see it work. But most likely outcome is that 20 years from now we're like, oh man, wasn't that a crazy time in our lives, and we were all betting on crypto becoming a thing. I think almost certainly the world is going to change because of crypto. Whether crypto wins or not, I really hope it does, but I don't know. But at the end of the day, my belief is that if Bitcoin does win, it solely wins as a store of value and not as a currency.
Cool. I'm just trying to see if I can find any questions in the app.
Okay.
We'll open it up for a few minutes for questions.
Let's do it.
Let's see. Do you see the app?
Me? I don't already have it up.
Yeah, okay. Just like the crash.
It crashed?
Good, great talk.
Just tell me they're being nice. They're being nice. I'm very scared of Bitcoin people.
Questions? Haseeb, what do you do?
What do I do? Mostly a bum these days. Yeah, I don't do a whole lot. Yeah, I was at Metastable Capital, which is a cryptocurrency hedge fund run by Naval Ravikant. And I recently left, and now I'm trying to figure out what I want to do next. So I don't know. Mostly, I'm wandering the streets at night, being a hooligan. Normal crypto stuff.
Another question is, what if the community doesn't accept Bitcoin as a store of value?
Then Bitcoin won't be a store of value. I mean, that's the fundamental roadblock, right? People don't. I mean, fundamentally, something being a store of value, like I said, is not a property of an asset; it's property of a market, and the market is people. So if people don't think that Bitcoin's store of value, then it won't be.
And another question was, what happens to the miners at the end of 2140? No miners. How does it work?
So miners will still exist.
Yeah.
They just won't be paid in block rewards. So right now, every time that you mine a Bitcoin block, regardless of whoever wants to transact in the network at any given time, you get a block reward in what's called the Coinbase transaction. So right now, you get some number of Bitcoins, and that will continue up until 2140. Every single block, even if you put no transactions in it. So you can mine an empty block if you want, and the vast majority of the income of a block is the block reward. In about a decade, that will, assuming that other things stay constant, in about a decade that will shift, so that 2/3 of the block reward is transaction fees and 1/3 is the block reward. As much because it's sort of a logarithmically declining reward, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller until 2140 when it stops outright, and the only reward for mining a Bitcoin block is transaction fees.
Yep. This is a good question, actually. What is the gold watch equivalent in Bitcoin? Ornamental value is a big part of the value of gold. I'm going to argue, I can give you a few things. I mean, I think the properties of Bitcoin are different than gold because Bitcoin is not physical. I would say things like censorship resistance. What else? It can't be seized from you. What do you think are the equivalent of ornamental value for Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think the answer is it doesn't have any. And so I think Bitcoin kind of challenges this notion that for something to be a store of value, it needs to have some floor of utility. I think this was an argument that was made very early on about Bitcoin that I think at this point, most economists don't really buy. I mean, if you look even at something like fiat currencies, right? Fiat currencies have no underlying utility. You don't need underlying utility for an asset to become sort of valuable. It's nice. It definitely gives you a price floor. Like gold has a price floor because of the industrial and jewelry ornamental demands for gold. But gold is used for a lot of non-ornamental and non-industrial use. I don't think it's intrinsically necessary for that to be the case. It's easier for an asset to bootstrap itself through having utility demand. But I don't see any reason why that stage can't be skipped in sort of the hierarchy of things becoming valuable.
Let's see. Do we believe Bitcoin is the only shot we have at a decentralized permissionless digital currency?
No,
not
at all.
No, not at all. Yeah, I think we're in agreement there.
Yeah.
What do you think of Facebook coin? How does it affect Bitcoin and crypto in general? I can start with this. I think it's interesting that the people are giving Facebook coin a lot of flack. I think it's actually good for the ecosystem as long as they do it right. And I think Facebook, given how much publicity it's gotten recently, it would be catastrophic if they didn't do it right, or it would just be stupid on their part to not do it right, meaning public, not private coins. I don't know. I think generally, I view Facebook coin potentially as a bridge for a lot of people, just like Coinbase served as a bridge for a lot of people into crypto. I don't view it negatively, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Haseeb.
So I think, one, we don't really know a whole lot about what Facebook coin is going to be. I think the speculation that we've gotten from, was it Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal that reported on this? That basically it's going to be, WhatsApp is going to basically have some kind of payment system that is, it settles on some blockchain. That's, I think, as far as we know. And so one is I'm always skeptical of any of these announcements about corporation doing blockchain something, because the reality is it's very hard at these large organizations for anything to pass legal and compliance and strategic muster to actually launch. So it seems like Facebook is devoting more resources to this than, I think I give it the benefit of the doubt that maybe this has a chance of launching, but I think the likelihood of this launch is still probably lower than 50% that this even happens. That said, I think if it does happen, I guess my most likely prediction of what will happen is essentially Facebook coin will essentially be like a backend for settlement for Facebook's payment layer. It remains to be seen if they'll build their own blockchain or if they'll co-opt another public blockchain to use. But probably like the people who are using Facebook Coin, my guess is that they won't be using anything else about blockchains. Right? Like they won't be using smart contracts. They won't be directly managing private keys. Right? Like the identity system is going to be WhatsApp, which totally makes sense because poor people around the world who are sending remittances or just exchanging, buying coffee or the equivalent of coffees in different parts of the world, buying chais. They have no idea what a private key is. They have no idea how to custody it. They have no OPSEC, right? Like this is not the kind of thing they're going to be dealing with. So I think it's basically going to be a way for Facebook to route around the traditional financial system, and essentially sort of have their own payments backend that doesn't require them to go through any middlemen, and sort of have a lower compliance and regulatory burden than they would otherwise. But I think that's a very smart move on their part. But I think in a lot of ways it's people using crypto but not proselytizing crypto.
Yeah, I totally agree. I want to end with one last question, and then I would love the audience to give us feedback on this as well, what you liked, what you didn't like, what other topics do you want debated. The last question I want to end with, Haseeb, is how far out until mass adoption, the $1 million question? I'll let you go first.
You let me go first? Mass adoption, I don't know. I mean, I think anything would be a guess. I would say we're probably at least, 5-10 years away. I mean, I'd say 10 is probably more accurate. Like, if this stuff works, stuff to get real adoption takes a long time.
Yeah.
Like, there's so much education that needs to be done to get people, competently using crypto. And the reality is, like, the vision that cypherpunks have about everybody managing their private keys and blah, 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 like, this is very unlikely to happen. I think something more akin to Facebook, where people have identity models that they relatively understand of like, okay, I know what my cell phone is. I know how to, interact with my friends on this thing. I don't know how to fat finger a private, I shouldn't be responsible for not fat fingering a public address when I'm sending money to my friends. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like the level of difficulty of using cryptocurrencies correctly is so incredibly high that I think it's very likely that cryptocurrencies will have to integrate into the other kind of, the other furniture of your digital life in a way that makes sense. I think it's much more likely in my mind that if crypto and blockchains win, that relative to other technologies like AI or IoT or whatever, I think that stuff is going to be very visible in your life. It's going to be very obvious that AI is radically transforming your relationship with the objects around you and your digital landscape. Whereas I think blockchain is much more likely to sort of change the backends for a lot of things, and for most people be roughly invisible.
Yeah, I completely subscribe to that thinking too. I think, like I said earlier, humans tend to overestimate what's possible in the short run, underestimate what's possible in the long run. I think for a long time people expected blockchain to be this like overnight switch, and then you're going to see like money flowing around everywhere. It's going to be like zoom, zoom, zoom. It's just like free internet money everywhere. Realistically, I think it's going to play out more like AI. AI just kind of happened in the background, and all of a sudden, like basically our worlds are run by AI. I think you'll see a similar narrative with Bitcoin or blockchain or any kind of cryptocurrency, where it won't be this like overnight, like, aha, we're in this magic world, but it'll be more like a multi-year, multi-decade kind of shift over time. So that's kind of how I see it.
Totally.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Haseeb.
Thanks for having me, Preeti.
And we'll talk soon.